taking part in the Eucharistic sacrifice, which is the fount and apex of the whole Christian life, the Christian faithful offer the divine victim to God and offer themselves along with it. We hear this idea quite often, but usually instead of the words fount and apex of the whole Christian life, we speak of the Eucharist as the source and the summit of our life of faith. And this idea was put very beautifully in that passage that I read from one of the documents of the Second Vatican Council, Lumen Gentium. And so even though this idea was sort of put forth in the council, it's not something that is new to the church. From the time of the apostles, the celebration of the Lord's Supper was seen as the high point of the Christian life. And in the 13th century, this devotion to the Lord's body and blood took on a new life with the institution of the celebration that we have today, Corpus Christi, the celebration of Jesus' body and blood, soul and divinity, truly present in the Eucharist under the signs of bread and wine. And in writing on the many traditions that have arisen around this celebration of Corpus Christi, one writer notes the extravagance that we see in the different areas of this celebration, in the decorations, in the vestments, in the processions. We see this in a lot of ways, and this author reflects on this idea of beautiful things surrounding our celebration. And this is what he writes. The closer their decorations are to the consecrated host, the richer and more intricate they become. I think that this is a great starting point for our reflections on this great feast. That just as with the decorations for the celebration, the same applies to us. That the decorations become richer, more intricate, more beautiful, the closer they get to the sacred host. And the same is true for us. The closer we are to the body of Christ in the Eucharist, the more beautiful we become. And we see this in the lives, especially of the great saints. Someone like St. Catherine of Siena, who for extended periods of time would live off of only the Eucharist. She wouldn't eat food, she would live off of the Eucharist. I don't recommend trying this. She had special graces to do this. But she was sustained by Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament. We see this in someone like Pope St. John Paul II, who spent the early hours of the morning praying at least an hour in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament, and then following up with the celebration of the Mass. By being plugged in, being tuned in to Jesus present in the Eucharist. We see this also in someone like St. Teresa of Calcutta, who made sure that her sisters spent time daily in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament, in Mass and in adoration, and that they knew that their work was inspired and sustained by their prayer in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament. And the same is going to be true for us. Right? That if we want our lives to be beautiful, to be meaningful, to be inspiring, that they have to center around and be close to the Eucharist. Now, how do we practically remain close to the Eucharist? Well, I'm glad you asked, because I have a few ideas that I'm going to share with you now. The first way, I think, is obvious, that we have to come to Mass. We have to make that at least weekly effort to stay close to Jesus in the Eucharist in a worthy reception at Mass. Other acts of piety and devotion are important. They're good, they're helpful. But they're good only insofar as they help us to celebrate better the Mass, to become more and more pure, to receive Jesus worthily. And so this is obvious on Sundays and holy days that we need to be at Mass. But I'll also challenge you to make it a priority to try to get to Mass during the week. Right? Maybe not everybody can get there every day, but to try to get there as often as possible. And we also have to look at how we view Mass. Right? Maybe we know that it's an obligation to get to Mass on Sundays and holy days, and we fulfill that obligation. But how do we do it? Do we do like young Father Broussard and complain and kick and scream every time we have to go? Or do we go willingly? Do we look forward to going to Mass? Maybe we don't want to tell anybody this, but do we look forward and enjoy it? Right? How do we view that obligation? Do we get here on time, or even early, to pray and to prepare for what is going to happen? Or are we constantly scooting in at the last minute, or even maybe after? We call this the miracle of the multiplication. I can begin the procession in the back of church with an empty church, and by the time I make it up here and turn around, everyone's here. Right? Do we look forward to coming and show that by getting here early to prepare well? Do we stay till the end of Mass? Or do we leave early? I was growing up, we would make trips back to Jeanneret quite frequently. That's where my parents were from and my family was there. And they had a sign above the holy water font at the back of church that said Judas was the first one to leave Mass early. Tried to deter anyone who might be trying to sneak out. Hey, we're not going to put those up. Well, that's up to Father Chester, but I don't think we're going to put those up. But it should challenge us to stay till the end of Mass, to fulfill our obligation. Right? Do we believe that we need to be here in order to live our lives the way that God is calling us to? Right? That's really the heart of the question. The second way that we can remain close to Jesus, in addition to going to Mass, is through adoration. Right? Spending time regularly in the presence of Jesus in the Eucharist and the Blessed Sacrament. Whether the host is exposed or not, that doesn't matter, right? We still receive the graces. Whether we have a major revelation or not, it doesn't matter. We are transformed. Right? I've shared this, I think, a couple of times, that over the past few years, you could probably say that my prayer has been boring. There's not a whole lot that happens. It's not very interesting in a worldly sense, but it's essential. And in some ways, once we sort of get past those feelings of prayer, those sort of consolations, in some ways our prayer becomes even richer. Because we know that we're not going because we're going to feel good after, but we're going because we know that we need to spend time with our Lord. We're going because we know He deserves it. And we're going because we know that it sustains us, even if we don't have those good feelings. Right? Jesus is going to do work in us if we spend that time with Him. We have to show up. So the third way that we can continue to foster our devotion to the Eucharist and stay close to Jesus in the Eucharist is through acts of piety and devotion. They may seem like small things, they may seem like very external things, but they are incredibly important. And I'm a firm believer that if we let these things slip and if we deliberately get rid of them, that eventually our faith in the Eucharist is going to suffer. And so examples of these acts of devotion that can help us to remind us of the presence of Jesus in the Eucharist, one would be genuflecting. Right? Going down on a knee whenever we are going into the pew or whenever we pass in front of the tabernacle. Right? An outward sign, definitely an outward sign, but something that should remind us inwardly of what we really believe. Right? I don't pass by my friends and drop to a knee. Right? They would probably be pretty awkward. But they're not Jesus. Right? There is something special about that place. There's something special about what is contained in the tabernacle. And so to remind ourselves of that, we bow down. We show that honor to Him. Another way that we can do this is by frequently saying, Jesus, I love you. Right? Thinking of Jesus in the Eucharist, especially when we're in his presence, and to say, Jesus, I love you. Right? This is one of my favorite penances to give. And people, it's so funny, people sort of feel like they're getting off the hook when I give them this penance. Like, that's all you want me to do? You want me to go and kneel in front of the tabernacle and say, Jesus, I love you? So yeah, that's precisely what I want you to do. Because that's what it's all about. Right? Falling in love with him. And reminding ourselves of that love that we ought to have for him. Another outward sign that we can do to help to remind us of what we believe in the Eucharist is by making the sign of the cross when we pass in front of a church. I remember from being a very little kid, our parents instructing us to do this. Again, to remind us that this is not just some other building, but that there is something special and sacred that is housed here. And that we acknowledge that by that sign of the cross. Now, the final way that we can have these outward acts of piety and devotion to remind us of what we believe in the Eucharist is one of my pet peeves. It's by not talking in church. Right? Not necessarily just in Mass, but in the building. Right? Before we get in here, this was actually suggested to me in spiritual direction this past week. That before I go into the chapel, I should just take a half a second to stop and realize what I'm about to do. I'm about to walk into prayer. And so taking that moment to prepare myself to enter the chapel reminds me that there is something special about it. Something special about the place and something special about the time that I'm going to spend there. And so when we get to Mass early, like we're all going to do, we spend that time praying and preparing ourselves rather than talking. And during Mass, that's, I think, hopefully obvious. If you want to nudge someone and say, Father's not doing a great job today, wait till after, when you're riding home. And then after Mass, right, community is a wonderful thing, and we need it. And we come together as a community to worship. But this place is set aside for silence and prayer and worshiping God. And so if we want to have conversations, we can do that either in the vestibule or outside. Conversations will probably be short this time of year because it's hot, but if I can stand out there and all this, you can too. All right? But it reminds us again that this is a special place and that Jesus is present and that we should respect him. We're celebrating today something extraordinary. Right? Not only did God reveal himself to us, not only did God become man, not only did God suffer and die for us, but he left us his very body and blood to feast on, so that we could be transformed into what we receive. And so let us remember that just like the decorations have become more beautiful, more meaningful, more intricate, the closer they are to the Eucharist, the same is true for us. The more time that we spend in his presence, the closer we come to Jesus, the more beautiful our life will become to us and to all who see us.